are increasing the connections between traditionally what you might call the city core and these spaces in Bandung Regency. And I'll kind of discuss how I understand this space as part of the urban in Bandung. Just briefly, in terms of the high-speed train. So the high-speed train predates President Widodo. It was being planned initially under President SBA's administration. About in 2015, President Widodo chose China over Japan after kind of reviving the project and choosing China for several reasons, one of them being that state money wouldn't be used in the project, but that has state money has actually been used at this point in support of the project. And then in terms of the budget, there's been a budget increase of about 1.2 billion USD from the original 5.5. And transit-oriented development was meant to be one of the key forms of economic growth to kind of justify this massive investment. But it hasn't taken the form as it initially was thought it would. So I'll kind of discuss a little bit about that later. And then in terms of the railway, it just became operational last October 2nd, 2023. There's 4 stations, Halim and Karawang near Jakarta. Originally, there was going to be a station called Walini, but that was postponed in 2021, and Padalarang station was chosen as its replacement. Padalarang station is in West Bandung Regency, and Tagaluar station is in Bandung Regency. So how do I, how did I come to research the high-speed train from an infrastructure studies approach? So I'm influenced by a field within China studies, a subfield called Global China that works to get beyond these kind of visualizations, for example, like a map such as this, or higher level analyses, for example, of international agreements between China and its partner countries in terms of its overseas development projects. Researchers over the past, decade and a half, 2 decades have been working to see, what's actually happening on the ground that is lost in kind of the visual discourse that is produced in maps such as this. And within Global China, there has been an influential body of research that is emphasizing infrastructure studies as a way to understand what's actually happening on the ground for local communities. This is my advisor quoting from a paper he wrote, thinking about the benefits of infrastructural thinking in terms of how the social relationships become embedded within the materiality of the infrastructure, but perhaps, more importantly, how these materialities of the infrastructure through developing relationships with the pre-existing built environment, the socio-spatial conditions of these places, how they're producing unexpected impacts in these places. And so with that in mind, I wanted to understand how the railway is embedding itself in local communities with the pre-existing political economies and histories, and what are the outcomes that kind of uneven outcomes that are occurring for locals. And how does infrastructure studies fit within my approach to urban geography? So infrastructure studies really emphasizing the on-the-ground approach, qualitative, ethnographic in nature. And this meshes well with Southern urban geography, the focus on embodied experiences of urbanization, the materiality of urban life, and also the kind of possibility for comparison across many cities and kind of how new theoretical insights can be generated from cities that have been under-researched in the past. And then connecting to my interest in development geography and the spatial and temporal dynamics of development projects and just kind of capitalism at large. And ultimately, by synthesizing these, I hope to contribute to Indonesian studies, especially the focus on urban studies, as well as the really interesting research that's been done in infrastructure studies in Indonesia. And then connecting that with global China and how they kind of talk to each other to understand not only what's happening in Indonesia, but what can this say about Chinese overseas development at large. Right. So in terms of my methodology, I've arrived in Indonesia in January 2023, and I've been doing field work since then, except for 2 months back in the United States last summer. I would call my research ethnographic, not ethnography in the traditional sense where I'm not living in the communities, but I am doing many site visits every week, having interviews with people, having non-participant observation, walking through communities, spending time and talking to people. So a majority of my data is gathered through semi-structured interviews and non-participant observation. Participants ranging from locals impacted by the construction and implementation of the project to those actually working on the project, and then relevant government agencies, and then professional and academic experts. The photo at the top of this slide is a view from Tuglowater Station. Originally, this area was meant for transit-oriented development, and today there's still kilometers of rice fields and then kind of more rural compounds and communities that are still living alongside the high-speed rail station. And then the bottom photo is Padalarang Station in West Bandung Regency, where you can see it's a bit more of a kind of, perhaps it's not super clear in this photo, but it's a more densely populated urban kind of compound community. And I'll talk a bit more about those differences between these two areas a little bit later. But ultimately, my goal in terms of trying to understand Bandung as a metropolitan space that kind of transcends traditional boundaries of rural and urban spaces through infrastructure-led urbanization is understanding the relationality between these two communities near the stations, understanding the similarities and differences, how they are being impacted in similar and different ways through the same infrastructure project. So in terms of my research areas, I am not doing research in Cimahi or as much kind of like grounded research in Kota Bandung. Basically, all of my research is happening in West Bandung Regency and Bandung Regency. So when I go to spend time in the north near Padalarang Station, I'm riding the local train up to those areas. And when I go to the south, riding with Jackie, my research assistant, on his motorbike down to Tuglowater Station. So what this kind of gave me insight in terms of all the hours we have spent traveling through the metropolitan areas, understanding the connections between these spaces, the differences as well, how the metropolitan area changes as you travel to different parts of it, and what are these infrastructural linkages that are connecting these spaces across many kilometers. And this next slide is just to show you some images of kind of what the areas are like, at least immediately around Padalarang Station. So it's a bit more, like I said, of a dense community. You can kind of see all the traffic that happens in the road right outside of Padalarang Station with a lot of businesses. There's a bit more industry in this area. You can kind of see factories in the skyline when you're looking out from the station. And this is very different from the areas that you see when you look out from Tuglowater Station, ride your motorbike and walk around these areas where farming, for example, is still a really important livelihood for people, as well as, and this is a similarity in the northern region as well, where people are, having like daily construction labor as a livelihood or informal sellers. But one of the key differences in terms of livelihoods here is the prevalence of farming as compared to in the north. And so how am I, all these experiences, spending time talking to people in these communities, kind of how am I thinking about Bandung and its connection to urban studies in other parts of the world? So kind of thinking about how the demarcation or the kind of binary between what is a center and a periphery in a city and what is clearly urban and rural in the contemporary forms of urbanization are beginning to dissolve as cities are developing with multiple cores, especially on what you might call traditionally the periphery, that are being interconnected through circulatory infrastructure like flyovers, toll roads, high-speed trains. And kind of what does this dissolvement of the rural-urban divide, how can we begin to think about cities in these spaces that are being transformed through changes of circulation, changes of infrastructural connection? And what are the types of economies that are developing in these areas? So in thinking about cities of circulation, Tadiar writes about Manila in the Philippines and begins to think about Manila being constructed over multiple interconnected archipelagos that are connected through flyovers, and this city that kind of the people that are benefiting from this form of urbanization rely on people to provide for example, rideshare drivers or hired drivers, for example, so they can move in the city and still make use of the time as they travel throughout the city. And thinking about that in the Bandung sense, kind of thinking about how these changing infrastructural connections are producing certain flows of movement for particular people and forms of capital in the city. And so that's kind of in terms of thinking about these interconnections between what you might call like traditionally rural sites, like in Bandung Regency, and more peri-urban spaces in West Bandung Regency, how the flows of movement and people are generating different types of development in the areas that are interconnected and reliant on different types of flows of people, in which we can see all these different types of ways that people move around the city. You have in this top left photograph, a flyover, which you see all over Bandung, how you're able to pass over kind of the dense social spatial fabric underneath the flyover and save time. And then the kind of compounds and communities that exist underneath the flyovers. And then you have the high-speed train, perhaps the most famous new form of transportation in the region, but that exists alongside the local train and angkots around the city in which people travel. And so seeing how important infrastructure plays in connecting the city, and it got me thinking about how this connects to John Silver's new book on the infrastructural South. So thinking about how urbanization in many parts of the world, he says, especially the global South, are being produced as this material geography of interwoven socio-spatial processes that are simultaneously local and global, human and physical, cultural and organic, in which infrastructure and different types of infrastructural spaces like enclaves or corridors, for example, play a key role in contemporary forms of urbanization. And so it got me to think about what types of development are being generated alongside these new infrastructural connections. And in terms of Bandung, so John Silver writes that this urbanization is being driven by two types of economic accumulation. What we're seeing, he argues, in many parts of the world is urbanization without industrialization, and that a lot of the types of economies that are being facilitated through urbanization are extractive industries and real estate speculation. And I think through my time spent traveling throughout Bandung, you see a lot of the urbanization being driven by real estate speculation, property development that are being intimately connected with, for example, the high-speed train. So what types of new urban cores are being created in the metropolitan area that are not necessarily cores in the traditional sense, but perhaps centers of urban activity of urbanization? And then, so in summary, contemporary urban studies is kind of pushing us to think beyond the urban-rural dichotomy. City regions are being constructed through massive investments in infrastructure that in particular are reshaping the movement of people, things, and capital. Some people are moving and other people are not. Some people's movement is in support of the movement of other people. For example, rideshare drivers taking me where I would like to go. And that becoming a big part of how people move around these new spaces and the economies that are developing. And then ultimately thinking about Bandung, what types of economies are proliferating in these new urban spaces. And John Silver argues they tend to be extractive industries or real estate, kind of speculative urbanization. So in terms of Bandung, through all the time traveling around and seeing these different areas, began to think about it as this space of kind of infrastructural connectivity and disconnectivity that speaks a lot to this research I've been discussing today, in which areas that would typically be called rural, urban, and peri-urban are being more tightly interconnected into a mass regional urban space. And perhaps it's not correct to call the areas in Kabupaten Bandung rural as they become tightly connected with the high-speed train, for example, kind of then what type of language and kind of theory would that generate? And so that's kind of an ongoing thought of mine, thinking about. And that this is producing uneven development that is partly connected to these changes in infrastructural connectivity and changing forms of circulation. And ultimately, this economic growth, from what I can tell, is, at least in my research, really being driven and connected to forms of speculative property development, all the new town communities that are trying to appeal to people that don't want to live in kind of the traffic of Bandung or want to move to these more exclusive spaces, for example. And so in terms of methodology and like an infrastructure studies approach, one, in terms of just logically kind of why it makes sense to focus on infrastructure is forming the foundation of the changing urbanization in the metropolitan area. And this emphasis on qualitative on-the-ground research is really helpful in understanding how people's daily lives are being reshaped by these new relationships to different forms of infrastructure. And ultimately, kind of what I'm trying to think about is how we can understand these different spaces relationally, in terms of kind of how they shape each other as Bandung urbanizes over time, connecting spaces near Padalarang and the spaces near Tagluwar with spaces, for example, in Chumbaliat, which is the bottom photo, and how they all kind of have relationships to each other and shape each other. Yeah, so thank you, just acknowledgements. Thanks Jackie, who's here, my research assistant, who couldn't have done the research without him. My funding, Fulbright, for helping to put on this event and support this event, and also support my research. And we're excited, so thank you.
Thank you, David, for the interesting presentation. So we're gonna move on to the next presenter, Dr. Tessa Tabita, with her presentation titled From Theory to Practice, Insights and Challenges in Researching Indonesia Urban Politics and Mega Projects.
Thank you, Prof. Delik, for the invitation, and also thank you for SAPPK ITB for the opportunity to share my PhD research. I would like to tell a disclaimer first, because in this presentation I will not talk more focus on the findings and results, but I will talk more about the process, my research process, including the theory, theoretical building, and also methodology. I hope this will help you for the PhD, first year and second year PhD. Maybe it will help you to maybe reflect on your research. So the title of my presentation is From Theory to Practice, Insights and Challenges in Researching Indonesian Urban Politics and Mega Projects. My PhD title is Beyond a Space of Exception, the Multiscalar Politics of Mega Project Development in Indonesia. And I just finished my PhD at the University of Sheffield a few months ago. And yeah, I hope my presentation will tell you more about why I choose this topic and what I'm focusing on. So the first slide is about the literature map. I use this to help me, to frame my research focus. So in my research, I have three big themes surrounding mega projects study. And the first one is about mega project as growth-oriented strategy. So basically, in many cases, mega project considered as a pro-growth strategies. So mega project can be used to enhance economic performance of specific spaces, and usually it generates a capital accumulation and urbanization as a result. And then this notion somehow related to the idea of urban entrepreneurialism in some cases that promotes public-private partnerships, for example, in Western countries, in American and European countries. And also some of authors and scholars have found concepts, something like local states, So how the connectivity of global and local to generate capital accumulation and like global city region and also world cities is similar to this topic. And then the second branch is about mega project development approach, because usually mega projects usually characterized by unordinary governance practice in many cases, and or mostly in most cases, there is some changing in the governance structure for developing mega projects, and it's usually complex. And then, but there is some factors that that influence the differences between each cases. For example, in European and American countries, mega projects usually market-led initiatives, and it's indicating privatization of urban development. For example, in American countries, there is some real estate development, urban regeneration, and then they use this kind of approach for developing their mega projects. But somehow in some authoritarian states, such as Russia, China, and Singapore, who promote state-led mega projects, it's also mega projects usually driven by and controlled by the state. And as in some literature, it's related to the state capitalism literature. So somehow we can say it's a product of state capitalism. Mega project is a product of state capitalism. Yeah. And the third branch is about the scale politics in mega project development. So I use this scale as a factor that differentiate each changing of governance structure in every mega project cases. So in many cases, new actors beyond the state start to emerge in the development arenas, which requires the redistribution of power and responsibilities. The first one. And the second one, of state-led development initiative and international financial institution have contributed to boosting mega conurbation in process in Southeast Asia. This is closely related to what David said before, infrastructure investments from the powerful countries such as China, Singapore, for example, and other countries like Japan. Infrastructure financing has been globally invested to other countries. And then Scholar and Bersaglio also suggest that mega project infrastructure projects usually as a means to improve powerful states' ability to control the production of spaces. This is about a bit critical for argument, but yeah, in countries like Africa, mega projects is used by the powerful countries to like colonialize in the modern era, something like that. Yeah, and the literature has not fully explored the state-led mega project development dynamics in the context of states with limited financial capacity like Indonesia. So this project focusing on Indonesia as a ambitious countries to promote infrastructure-led development. It started, it's focusing on Jokowi's era because he's fully promoting infrastructure development in his presidency. For example, the state focuses on three agenda: infrastructure development, deregulation, and debureaucratization, to promoting infrastructure development. And there are some institutional reforms surrounding that to enhance the decentralization of power to the national state, including the increase of state-owned enterprises' capacity to manage mega projects. It's characterized in this period. And then President Jokowi also established national strategic projects policy. And these projects, national strategic projects, can cut existing planning administrative process. So it's kind of spaces of exceptions, I would say, in the future. And then it's also linked by the emergence of unusual governance arrangements surrounding the mega projects agenda, So Indonesian governments surely has limited political and financial power. So they have no capacity to build these mega projects themselves. So they still have to promote attract investors to finance their mega projects. That's why they still have dependency on non-state budgets and encouraging capital investment and partnerships with other countries such as China, for example. And this model, we can say it's combining a state-led development approach that in powerful states, and also try to still still to attract international financial institution. So it's more like a hybrid or combination between the common approach that I said before. So in the additional issue also, it's about the democracy. Indonesia is a democratic country, so we have like regional autonomy. So there is some tension or influence the dynamics between levels of governments also to be part of my discussion. So that's why it's important to investigate how this Indonesian strategy operates and identify the consequences of the governance restructuring surrounding mega projects agenda. So in my PhD research, I have 4 research questions. So the first one, how does Indonesian government make use the national strategic projects to create spaces of exceptions at the national level? And also the second question, what kind of governance structure was put in place to deliver the Jakarta-Bandung high-speed railway projects? It's my case study. I will tell you later why. And how do actors at various scales perceive and influence this project? And the third question is, how does the Sino-Indonesian cooperation, because this is bilateral transnational mega projects, so it's involved 2 countries. That's why it's also part of my investigation. And then the fourth questions is, what are the implementation of challenges and consequences of creating these exceptionality measures to accelerate the development of mega projects. For the conceptual framework, I have two 2 levels of domain. Like the first, the upper domain is more likely on how the global and national dynamics influence the governance restructuring surrounding mega projects, and the lower domain is more likely focusing on how mega projects nature influence the governance restructuring surrounding mega projects. And I use the 2 lens for looking at the dynamics surrounding mega projects, surrounding governance in mega projects. The first one is state rescaling, to understand how mega projects become a tool of spatial and institutional structuring. And for this specific case, I use it to investigate the institutional and regulatory reforms to expedite the PSN National Strategic Projects delivery, and to how the establishment of Indonesia-China joint venture company operates. And then the second lens, I use the regime analysis to identify the actors, resources, and agendas for mega project development, and also analyze the multi-level actors' interactions. So I will look at, because the regime analysis focusing on the local, the traditional regime analysis focusing on the local level, but it has potential to go beyond that. So that's why I use regime analysis as a lens here, combining with state rescaling. So basically, my research designs based on the previous slides is to investigate Indonesia, a country with financial and political constraints, pursues its ambitions for large-scale mega project developments, and to examine the implications of the strategies employed. Basically, there are 2 levels, like I said before. The first one is for analyzing the state restructuring processes, And the second one to analyze the consequences of mega project development approach in Indonesia. I have four objectives to answer the questions. Objective one, to analyze the national scale policy environment. And the second objective, to analyze the emergence of new institutional arrangements. And the third objective, to identify the challenges of international cooperation in governing mega projects. And objective four, to identify the effects of exceptionality measures in expediting mega project delivery. Yeah, in my research, I use critical realism stance. It's because it fits to study mega projects. I can investigate underlying structures and mechanism in mega project development, and I try to move beyond observable phenomena to incorporate underlying realities as well, because I want to explore how mega projects governance restructuring in developing mega projects operates. And then I also recognize the diverse mechanism in urban development related to mega projects, like physical, socioeconomic, cultural, and other. And why is it relevant? Because we can emphasize the causal relationship between social conditions, urban structure, and agent or actor actions. And it's also highlights the influence of power dynamics and authority on mega project trajectories. Yeah. Same with David, we have case study of Jakarta-Bandung high-speed railway. Why I choose Jakarta-Bandung high-speed railway? Because it's one of the flagships of PSM in Jokowi, President Jokowi, and it aims to connect to main metropolitan cities. So it has the characteristics of a massive mega project impact. And also this project also involve many actors at the different levels. It's mainly funded by Chinese Development Bank, and also encourage a collaboration between countries and institutionalized to newly established institutions for specific mega projects. So that's why it's a part of governance restructuring as well. Yeah, as David also mentioned, there will be transit development orientation development, but it's still in plan. It's not yet started. But if it happens, this project potentially affects many cities and regencies. And also these national scale projects have required changes in the provincial and municipal level special plan as well. So yeah, it's very complicated project, and that's why it's interesting to look at. In the methodology, yeah, I use for disclaimer, I did my field work during COVID-19. So yeah, primary data collection, I use semi-structured interview focusing on the elites that involved in the mega project in Jakarta-Bandung high-speed railway, and also for to support this interview, I also use various document sources such as law and regulations, international reports, news articles, national, provincial, and local development plan, and also Jakarta-Bandung high-speed railway plan. And for the analysis, I use the qualitative coding analysis for this, and to arrange the discussion by teams concerning the strategy, procedure, and challenges of mega project development. And for the tools, I use NVivo to help me organize and visualize the result. Yeah. I will tell you about this because in the process of doing research, this my identity and my positionality also influence the process during my field work. So I have an Indonesian nationality, so I have a cultural understanding of the context first, and also I have access to network to to maybe administrative processes. I know the contextual and the procedural processes, so it helped me to do this research. But the disadvantage is maybe I have a perceived bias because I am an Indonesian, and I also have maybe over familiarity of the context. So it also will influence at how I perceive the object of research. And my second identity is I'm a lecturer at Institut Teknologi Bandung. It's one of the top universities in Indonesia. So maybe other persons will look at me have academic credibility, and I also have professional network that I can use to, for example, to gain contact for my interviewees, for example. And the minus or the disadvantages, maybe there's a power dynamics between me and the participants, and also there will be maybe institutional constraints or conflict of interest when I did my research. And the third one, my third identity or positionality is I'm an LPDP scholarship awardee. It's a national prestigious scholarships in Indonesia. And so maybe I have some recognition and respect when I'm doing my research in Indonesia. But on the other hand, they maybe have expectations of results or in my of my research. Yeah, there will be influence from this. And also I am an alumni of urban and regional planning. I have subject matter expertise and also alumni network that I can utilize. But yeah, the disadvantages maybe I have a pre-existing base and conflict of interest. The last one is I'm PhD I am a PhD. Previously, I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Sheffield, so I have international perspective and research credibility from the perspective of Indonesian government. But they maybe have concern like I have potential misalignment with local context or perceived foreign influence in my research. So yeah, this will be consideration of how the results of my research process later. Yeah, the one of the highlights of my fieldwork is the impact of COVID-19, like I mentioned before. So I have planned my research is for about 6 months, from January to May, June or July, but it's extended to August. The pandemic disruption, I have to change the processes, procedures. So I have to navigate new regulations and restrictions and be flexible on the every changes in the country, and also at the local level or in the city or the districts. And also I have method change. So the first interview, I did my first interview offline, so face-to-face interview. But after that, the restriction happened, so I have to change to online interviews. All of my interviews unfortunately can do the online interviews because they have access to technology. So fortunately it didn't change much my research direction. So other adjustment and adaptations, I use my network to expand respondent pool. So for example, I first only have 10 lists of respondents, but I expand through the personal connections. And other adjustments also about the dynamic targeting. So I modify target interviews on the ground according to the events and improve understanding of my research. And also in doing research on mega projects and also political processes, I think snowball sampling will be beneficial because it can leverage existing connections or existing respondents to identify additional stakeholders that relevant to the research. And yeah, it's also effective in Indonesia, in the Indonesian context to reaching high level officials. So I promote this snowball sampling when, for example, you can use public connection, maybe for example, to get the contact of high level, high rank officials. So my reflections, one of my reflections doing the online interviews. So it can enhance the research techniques because we also have the visual recording to offer comprehensive data collection, but it's not in my research, but it will be advantage for people who need the visual analysis. And also it can also facilitate observation of gesture, enriching qualitative analysis. And the other advantages may be in doing elite interviews. We usually have like power dynamics or power imbalance between us, the researcher, and also the participant or elites, for example, like a mayor or maybe minister. This online interview can alleviate this power imbalance because we are not in the same room. We usually have like tend to have a pressure, but I didn't feel like I have pressure during my interviews. Yeah, I was like chill and I can talk. I can ask any confidential, maybe confrontational questions, and I can maintain the interview environment and also, yeah, fostering candid responses. And it allows also for direct questioning, and yeah, it's also convenience for these elite participants to accommodate their busy schedules. And for my data analysis, I use the coding analysis, collective coding. So these are the steps of data analysis process. And for the results, so initial analysis of the interview, I can produce 42 open codes from the interviews, and also these open codes, I categorize these open codes into thematic codes and grouping into the same category, and I visualize the network here with and vivo to help identify the connections and pattern. And for the results, I separate discussion into 4 themes for prominent topics to answer my research question. So first question will be in chapter 5 to 4 to 6, 7. So chapter 4 to 7 will be the discussion. In the process of doing my research, there's an ethical issues and considerations, and this will be also related to you in doing your research. So there are 3 points related to ethical. So the first one is related to research participants. So how to get participants awareness of our research. So all participants were given an information sheet that outline our primary research objectives, the nature of informations, and also how the data will be used in your research. So they have awareness of this research. And for the sensitive information, because my research talking about mega projects and political processes, of course, it will be sensitive. So in my case, some questions were excluded, or any information shared by the participant that they wish to keep off the record was treated with confidentiality. I try to, if it's important information, I try to find another sources to gain similar information. And for the safety of participants, individual were kept anonymous, and only their positions and institutions were disclosed in my research. And in the ethical issues related to researchers, there are two in my case, researchers bias. So to prevent the bias, I presenting the data and conducting analysis without hiding any results. And for the interview translation, I did the interview excerpts personally, the translation personally, and also use it for analysis due to the sensitivity of information. So I didn't send to the third party the interviews, and also to minimizing bias from the third party translator. And the last one, the last issue is related to funding organization, because my sponsor is LPDP. Maybe it's there is a research integrity issue. So, but the sponsor didn't impose any restrictions on the research or prohibit the publication of any aspect. So no interference from the funding body. So it will be, I have fully control over the study, how the study conducted. Yeah, maybe thank you for your attention. Feel free to ask any question later. Thank you.
Thank you, Tessa, for sharing quite in-depth your research experience during your PhD. And we will have now coming to the last presenter, Mr. Anders Christian Muller. He's going to present the title Public Aspiration and Mobile Policies, Studying Up Urban Planning in Indonesia. Mr. Anders, you can start.
Great, thank you. Before I begin, I want to just check with our online audience. Can you hear me? Please give me a thumbs up if you can hear me, everybody in the audience. Thumbs up if you are awake and you can hear me.
Yeah.
Are there any thumbs?
Yes,
Yes.
you're fan.
Okay, very good.
Yeah.
I mean, it's always difficult being the third speaker, because the truth is by then most people are halfway asleep. So I will try and keep my presentation a little bit short, a little bit lighthearted, even though actually I really took the topic matter so closely to heart that my presentation is mostly focusing on the methods aspect. Sorry, let me just try and get the technology to work. Does that work? Okay, there's a lag. All right. I don't think I need to go through the structural outline. Fortunately, you also already know my bio. Needless to say, I have a very interdisciplinary background. One thing that I wanted to very quickly highlight, which has shaped me as a researcher, is the fact that I actually worked within public policy in Myanmar for a couple of years. I was affiliated, as part of my ODI fellowship, I was affiliated with two different policy think tanks between 2017 and 2019. And that experience has really had a big influence on me, not just in terms of how I view policy, but also the kinds of questions that I'm interested in studying, and also how I go about studying those questions. So to really give a better overview of who I am as a researcher today, I also wanted to just briefly touch upon my research interests, which have been kind of all over the place. My bachelor's and MPhil theses were quite different, and also are very much different from what I ended up doing for my PhD. But I've had for a very long time actually an interest in issues related to urbanism, and more specifically to urban governance. Some of the people who have influenced me in my journey include geographers who have a non-geography background, people like Jane Dyson, Professor Jane Dyson at University of Melbourne today, who actually was originally trained as an anthropologist before she became a geographer, or people like Ayuna Datta, who was an architect by training, then did her PhD in sociology, and is today a very well-respected geographer working not only on issues of governmentality in in Indian cities, but also on mega urbanization in the global south. In fact, her seminal book from 2018 has a chapter written by none other than Professor Dele Kudala, who's with us today. So a great book that I really recommend people to read. And that kind of gradually led me to my PhD research to date. So broadly speaking, I'm looking at the political geography of IKN, the proposed new capital city of Indonesia. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about it at all today, but I'm happy to talk more about it another time. But very, very briefly, some of the things that I'm looking at for my PhD research, first of all, takes a policy mobilities approach, which means that I'm studying the assemblage of how different things, different people and ideas and policies and actions led to what we see today as IKN, as a built space in Eastern Kalimantan. And I'm also taking a power topologies approach, which in simple terms means that I think about space relationally. I like to study how networked actors and institutions go about extending their influence and control over new territories. And I think it's very interesting to also study the importance of legitimacy as well as epistemic communities in the role of creating these spatial outcomes that we see today. For some super short empirical context, I hate to say this, but IKN is not that special. There's a lot of new cities being built from scratch around the world, more than 100, maybe about 150 by now. This is a quick map from Sarah Moser's 2020 paper. She's published a lot on new cities. But yeah, as I mentioned, my presentation might be a little bit boring, but hopefully, like Butessa, I'm hoping it can appeal to graduate students who are planning their own research design right now. So I want to quickly talk a little bit about ontology and epistemology. I think these slides might arguably be a little bit too boring and abstract, but very, very, very briefly, ontology really deals with the nature of knowledge. Epistemology deals with how we access that knowledge. And then as social scientists, we usually take meta-theoretical approaches, which basically outlines our underlying philosophical assumptions. And then finally, we get to the research methods. So personally, I start off from the perspective of bounded relativism. Relativism tends to mean that we believe that there's multiple realities that exist, but there's different ways of conceptualizing it. When we say that it's bounded, what we mean is that these different social realities exist for 4 different groups of people, and that those realities are equal, but exist with porous boundaries. So although we cannot, they cannot necessarily be directly communicated because each individual person, each group of people have their own unique subjectivities and positionalities, which Butessa talked a little bit about. We can still try to understand these truth claims that are created within and between those groups. That also means that I don't really think that truth claims, at least insofar as we're talking about social phenomena, are objective or have a capital T. I think they have a lowercase t. And I think that different truths exist within the empirical world, within an empirical world that's material, but yet at the same time socially constructed. Constructivism, to me, means that meaning between people and between groups is an interplay between them. And that moreover, subjects create their own individual collective reality about different observed objects and events that we then have to go about trying to understand in a relational manner. But maybe I should quickly add a caveat. I'm not a subjectivist per se or a relativist. Sorry, I'm not a pure subjectivist or a pure relativist. It's just that I believe in bounded rationality and that the world as we are and the world as we see it is socially constructed. I like to think of it in terms of, imagine if you have a big wooden barrel and you take a bunch of tennis balls of different colors and you dump them into the barrel and then you shake the barrel around, right? Sometimes those tennis balls of similar colors will come close to each other. Other times they'll be separated. They bounce between each other. Sometimes they influence each other. But any one tennis ball cannot necessarily see the perspective of the others. But it's our job as social scientists to at least attempt to take a step back and see the image as a whole. Oh, super quickly, my meta-theoretical approaches. Well, first of all, I like to think of myself as a post-colonial urbanist, which I think should be of interest to, of course, a lot of us here in Indonesia trying to understand Indonesian cities. What I think that means, in simple terms, is that I don't take any theoretical approaches from Western urban spaces for granted. I don't necessarily think that they translate to different contexts like Indonesia or in the so-called global South. I'm also a little relational geographer, which kind of comes across from my epistemological perspectives. And I also tend to think of myself as a post-structuralist. And what I mean by that is, in essence, that I think social phenomena and processes are a result of complex interplays between different people and institutions, and that you actually cannot predict a priori what the outcomes are going to be, even based on the influence of any one person or group of actors, and that those groups of people and individual actors also cannot predict the outcomes of what they do. Make it a little bit more sensible. I think that when policymakers come up with big fancy ideas for high-speed rails or new capital cities, that they actually truly cannot 100% predict or influence the outcome, the spatial outcomes, which makes it all the more important to understand those constructs and networks that give rise to what we see in reality. I'm about halfway through, at least time-wise. Okay, so there's two things that I want to kind of emphasize today, which I think which will hopefully be of interest to the audience. Number one, what it means to study up elites and elite spaces, and number two, what it means to take a policy mobilities approach to urban studies. Whoa, hope my laptop doesn't crash in the middle of this. Okay, so I'll start with some of the more easy things. Studying up is basically an anthropological approach orientation to trying to study the culture and spaces of those individuals in our societies who are in a position of wealth and power. Anthropologists and social scientists usually contrast this with studying down, which is when you're attempting to, because there's always going to be epistemological barriers, when you're attempting to study the everyday lived experiences of people who are at the grassroots level, people who are often marginalized or at the very least lower income. And I often say, and I know that David doesn't describe himself that way, that basically we are studying extremely similar things, but we're each other's foil. I'm trying to study up and he's trying to study down, which I think is, both approaches are incredibly valuable and give us different perspectives sometimes about the same things. But needless to say, studying up is really hard, right? I mean, elites aren't exactly known for coming and hanging out with us in Wartex and having lunch with us there. So first of all, you have access barriers. How do you access these people? How do you access these institutions? How do you access these spaces, right? Second of all, I'm not sure if I agree with this criticism, but it's a common one in the literature. People also, some authors have argued that elite spaces have unique and opaque organizational cultures. It can be difficult for us as researchers to understand. Thirdly, elites often are pretty busy people. So even if you work closely with them, they might not have time to sit down with you. And if they do, they might be on the clock and run away after 15 minutes. Some things that I think are more important and does indeed make this kind of research challenging is that there's a pretty big difference between formal and informal networks or formal and informal structures. So even if you, for example, gain access to an elite institution, what you see formally on the ground is not necessarily reflective of the informal networks behind the scenes, is not necessarily reflective of how people go about doing their work, right? So if, for example, I was to get access to Otorita ICAEN, there's a formal hierarchy, there's an organizational structure, but behind the scenes, there's much more complex interpersonal networks that influences how work, and by extension, how ICAEN is actually being developed on the ground. I particularly, although I'm not so sure to what extent I'm going to incorporate it into my research, I find Weddell's recent paper on influence elites particularly interesting. So Weddell is an anthropologist who theorizes that contemporary elites actually operate through more fluid and informal institutional networks than previous or traditional hierarchies and stable networks of so-called power elites. And that means that these individuals often move between different institutions and in between different roles, sometimes in the same institution, sometimes in different institutions, which creates a kind of evolving door. This enables influence elites to exert their power much more flexibly and fluidly, including, for example, through indirect measures, using other institutions and other institutional actors to follow through on their own objectives. Say, for example, think tanks, right? If you want to influence the world today, set up your own think tank. Or through consulting companies, right? So a lot of some of the most what I would consider some of the most powerful and influential urban planners today became that way because they worked, for example, for Arup or McKinsey or PSUD. I think, however, there's a lot of benefit, even despite these challenges, I think there's a lot of benefits of studying up elite spaces. First of all, you get to disaggregate and humanize these supposed elite practices, and you realize that these people are not necessarily that different from us. They're very much fallible. Second of all, I think that by unlocking or uncovering everyday practices and interactions, we learn more about the kinds of things that lead to visible policy outcomes. Now, typically it's anthropologists who've tried this, but it's all as a method, but it's also increasingly working its way into urban geography, including, for example, Maria Kuz, who has done research, in-depth research on the role of embodied knowledge and personal networks in transnational diplomatic settings. So she studied diplomacy by the European Union in Brussels. I'm not actually sure exactly how she got access to those spaces. I think she might have been an analyst or a consultant working with diplomats. A more recent paper, I do not know how to pronounce his name, but he was actually a PhD student in my department at NUS, originally from Finland. And he himself was a diplomat. So he actually conducted an autoethnographic study of the unique role of embassy saunas in the creation of informal milieus, which gave rise to informal social interactions that had a very much real and concrete implications for the international diplomatic affairs, particularly for Finnish diplomats, but also for the other the other embassies that they interacted with. It's a very fun, but also really cool and unique research, adapting a very unique research, innovative research methodology. Okay. I'll try and move a bit fast through this, but I personally find policy mobilities fascinating. To me, policy mobilities is both a subdiscipline of urban geography, but also an approach to studying and interpreting policy processes. Policy mobilities tend to look at how, what, and why policies, particularly in urban spaces, are formulated, and how those policies are made mobile, right? So I'll give a really interesting example that actually touches upon Indonesia. How many of you have heard of bus rapid transit systems? Okay. And where do you think BRT was invented? Or where was the first place of BRT?
Bogota.
Okay, so I hear someone say Bogota. Anyone else? So Bogota, the Transmilenio or whatever it was called system, it's the archetypical success story of BRT. But guess what? It was not invented or even created for the first time in Bogota. Bogota actually copied a different system from Brazil. But we don't know that most of the time. Why? Because it's the Bogota model, which was packaged as an urban mobility solution that could be exported and replicated across the world, including in Jakarta today, right? Not that it was copy-pasted, it's always localized, but we think of that as the archetypical model. But policy mobilities helps to show how that is not necessarily the case. Perhaps more importantly, if you're a constructivist or a critical social scientist, policy mobilities believes that, in contrast to positivist social scholars, believes that policy is always circulating, always changing or mutating as it moves between different locations and actors and institutions and spaces. And that's why we don't use the term policy transfer. We don't believe, if you're a policy mobility scholar, the policy is transferred from A to B. It's actually mutating between different spaces. All right. And I think policy mobility is really helpful, both as an approach and as both as a theoretical framework, but also as a research approach to decenter dominant narratives and how policy is rationalized, and to show how that policy is made mobile, for example, like the Bogota BRT model, and also analyze the funky and sometimes random ways that policies are embedded in new social and political milieu. One particular study that is interesting, if people have the time to look it up, is a book by Astrid Wood called How Cities Learn. So she looked at how BRT was adopted as a popular transit solution in South African cities, and she actually used policy mobilities as her anchor for developing her own research approach called tracing. So there's some really interesting literature on that I can share with people if they're interested. sorry, technology, there we go, cool. So what were my research methods? And I have to go through this very quickly, unfortunately. Well, first of all, in the design phase, I was planning to use semi-structured interviews, particularly of elites, planners, and so-called middling bureaucrats who work in ministries that actually help to enact policies like IKN, and also, if possible, participant observation from within one of the planning agencies like OIKN. And I was thinking about maybe also doing some social network analysis. Now, as any of the people sitting at this panel and many people in the audience already know, reality is usually not the way we intend it to go. So what did I actually do? Well, I did get access to elites and planners. I could not get access to middling bureaucrats, funny enough. I see Butessa is nodding her head. And what I ended up doing instead, without even realizing it at first, but this presentation helped me realize that I did something cool. I ended up talking a lot with consultants. So people who had been contracted or subcontracted or subcontracted to work on government tenders in IKN. And these architects and urban planners and landscape designers have been, they don't have the exact same positionality and information as bureaucrats, but they do have unique insight into the process of working for the government and helping to put their vision or visions, many of which are contradictory, into reality in build space in East Kalimantan for IKN. I also couldn't do any participant observation, although I was able to do some institutional collaborations. I'm, for example, doing a project with Pak Delik. I was also sometimes working, assisting Smeru Research Institute in Jakarta with a few things, which brought me closer to the policy process. My field work has been about 11 months long. I've got, oh, yes, David, before we came into the room, reminded me it's really good to show pictures. So I was like, cool, here's a picture of me doing research. This is Bambang Brojonegoro, the former minister of the National Development Planning Agency. Lovely guy, by the way. So some very, very brief concluding thoughts, which might be food for thought for the people in the audience. First of all, I would speculate that Indonesia is entering or already has entered some kind of new mega urbanization phase or moment. And I think that makes it really, really important now more than ever to raise question. Oh, 5 minutes? I thought I only had 30 seconds left.
Yeah, actually.
Okay. But that's why I was talking so fast. I'll keep going. So first, I lost my mojo. So first of all, I think that this mega urbanization moment makes it more important than ever to ask questions about elite aspirations and how those aspirations might differ from the aspiration and needs of non-elites. And by non-elites, I mean basically everyone. It could be us, it could be middle classers, it could be lower income people, it could be the people who are construction workers building the Garuda in KIPP in IKN, right? These are all non-elites, and I think their aspirations are just as important as everyone else's. And those aspirations are probably not the same as the elites who are conceptualizing and planning IKN. And this approach, studying up elites, my approach that is only one of many, right? And there's no right or wrong. I love David's work, not despite, but because it is so different from what I'm doing. I think it takes a village. We need all these different approaches. And mine is just one of many. And I think my approach of trying to studying up elites and elite spaces is difficult, but very much necessary. Second of all, I think that as social scientists, especially if you're a young social scientist who's planning your own research right now, I think it's important to be flexible, especially if you're trying to study flexible and dynamic spaces. And it's also important to be innovative, right? So Astrid Wood, the example I gave earlier, she came up with her own method that she calls tracing, which was similar to and inspired by, but different from Jennifer Robinson's what Jennifer Robinson called tracing, right? So don't be afraid to try new things, to innovate and come up with new methods that are more flexible. And third, my final thought is that, you know what, social science research, it's messy, but so are the things that we're trying to study, and elite spaces are definitely no exception. So thank you very much. I hope that that was interesting and that people will have some questions.
Thank you, Anders. So we are now already passed through the last presenter. And we are delighted here to have Ms. Seichia. So actually, they have similar shared interests on infrastructure, mega project, new cities kind of things. But the thing is they have different stages in their research. Like Tessa is just completed her PhD. David and Anders is halfway or already passing through the halfway, hopefully. And Tessa is just landing through this new research. So maybe we can have fresh insight from Tessa about what these people have done so far. Yes.
Okay, so thank you. I'd like to thank our colleague to invite me to this panel. So as he mentioned, I talked to him last week by a chance, and then I wanted to get some research advice because I just started my field work this month, and he said, "Yeah, why don't you attend this panel? It's a perfect opportunity for you to ask questions." And I think it's very rare to have like a panel focusing on research method and also in a very, like a theoretical but also practical sense. So I really appreciate this opportunity. And by listening to the three presentations, so I have like 5 points to share among all of you, and then like a very minor question to each of you as well. So I think I'm also doing research about infrastructure, and I'm looking at the Chinese and Japanese infrastructure project in Indonesia. So then my question is, what is so unique about infrastructure or mega projects you are looking at? Like, what is the epistemological advantage by starting a research looking at infrastructure or mega project? So I think in critical infrastructure literature, one thing we say is no one decides, things just happen in a contingent manner. But then if I ask you to identify 1 or 2 actors that are really powerful in shaping the decision-making process, based on your research, who do you think they are? And also like where to start, it's really messy and, wide network of people involved and interest involved. And the second point is, in the beginning of the research, you want to explore, you want to be flexible and open-minded. But then at what stage you feel, oh, this is time to narrow down? What is the turning point in your research? And also like how the research question evolved over time when you, wrote your proposal and then you start data collection and where you are now. And like, I think the third question is more like practical. So, how to get access to stakeholder for interview, especially for foreign researchers. I know most of you using like Snow or something, but then, how we overcome the language and cultural barrier and also limited knowledge in the beginning in the local context. So how do we build trust with the local actors? And, some of you are doing interview targeting elites. So do you really record those interviews? I think like, recording is useful for you to transcribe later, but then do they feel comfortable doing that? Or do you even bring up that question at all? And I think the fourth point is about what counts as truth. So I think you all kind of touched about it theoretically. So in practice, like if you do interviews, different actors, they tell you different stories, then how do you decide? How do you triangulate with the interview data and other sources of, data or knowledge or policy? So I think like, we talk about this issue theoretically all the time, but then do you have any examples? You talk to 5 people, they tell you different things, how you make the, decision. So this is a story, a goal in my research, and it makes the most sense to me. So I think it's a process you co-create with your interviewees, but then if you have any example to share. So I think the last one is about knowledge production itself, and also the dialogue between theory and the practice in infrastructure or urban research. So I think Ander talked about post-colonial urbanism. And, we also talk about in development studies or urban studies, we talk about decolonizing knowledge production. So I think like who we choose to cite in our research itself, it says something about who we are as a researcher, and we are doing research in Indonesia. So I think like, in the global South urban studies, we try to theorize from the South, but then there are still other, geographies. So I'm wondering, I think I saw almost all of you citing the theories produced, by scholars in maybe, like a Western educated scholar, and I think including all of us as well. So I think that's the theorization by those scholars from other geography or even in the global South context. Do you feel they're adequate to explain the case of Indonesia? Any connection or disconnection here? So those are the 5 major points. And I think that some of them can be challenging, but you don't need to answer all of them if you have any answers to any of those questions. And I think then the remaining just like a minor question for each of you. So I think for David, I'm interested to know, you look at global China and also urban studies. You look at this Jakarta Bandung high-speed rail project. Why you decided to focus on Bandung in your research and where that you arrive in that decision. And for Tessa, I think you are also in different stage compared to 3 of us. You already finished your PhD, so I'm curious to know, after your PhD, how did your research evolve over time? Are you still working in this topic in like what ways? And did the data you collect in your PhD still helpful in shaping your research today? And for Anders, I'm just curious, like I'm also doing this study up approach. So I'm thinking why you decided this approach, what the advantage and disadvantage. So that's all from my side. So yeah, once again, I'd like to thank for this opportunity to ask questions.
Thank you, Mr. Xia. I think it's quite thorough investigation of what they are presented. I will give space for any of the presenter to give a response. Who is gonna take the first turn? Well, actually, we are quite running out of time, so we'll have in total we still have quite some time actually.
We have about 40
20
minutes.
minutes for-
40 because we start a bit late.
Yeah. So it's about
30-ish.
30 minutes discussion, so you can after this, we will expect some comments or question from the audience.
Let's say 5 minutes.
Yeah. Yes, I think mostly at most 5 minutes.
Jensen, do you want to start since you're the senior?
Yeah. Senior. Okay, maybe start with the first question. What is the unique about looking at infrastructure and mega projects, especially my case of Jakarta Bandung High-Speed Railway? I think infrastructure as an object of study is still rising in the last decades, and it's still happening. Also, it's important because especially in the global south, there is an emerging development, infrastructure developments are quite massive in the global south. So it's very interesting to look at. And Indonesia is one of the countries that pursuing infrastructure development. So in my opinion, it's very interesting to study infrastructure and especially mega projects. For example, we all studying mega projects, IKN, and also Jakarta Bandung high-speed rail, and maybe other case study that will be interesting to look at. We can explore that in the future. And for in the beginning, we are usually want to explore everything. So when is the turning point to narrow down? So in my case, my proposal or research designs was quite ambitious, maybe, because I want to not only looking at the governance and political aspects, but also the social, the spatial transformations. But my supervisors told me that it's not feasible in to do that in your PhD. It may be for different topics, and you can look at in other research projects maybe. So how to narrow down? Maybe you can focus on what you want to explore specifically. So maybe first focusing on the aspect or the literature you want to involve. Maybe from my presentation, the first presentation is mapping your literature to help you to decide what is your contribution to those literatures. So the first thing, the first steps is to define those areas. So for the graduate students or PhD student, it's important to focusing your research. So it's the steps to look at the focus. And then how to get access to the interviewees. Basically, I have a lot of advantages, like I present in my presentations, like I shared before. So to get access to the interviewees, I use my personal connections and maybe other colleagues connections, Pak Delik, maybe, or Pak Wilmar's connections. I use as the first step, and then I snowballing after that. So it helps us, maybe if you want to reach an elite actors, maybe you have to have like connections to academicians or consultants. They tend to have a lot of communication with governments. Like also Anders also shared before in his research. And then maybe how to overcome language barrier. I cannot answer this. Maybe Anders and David can share their experience. Do you really record your interviews? Yes. I record all of my online interviews, and also when face-to-face, I recorded audio. I have audio recording files. So yes, I record because I have limitation in my brain and my memories are not good. So yeah, it's important to keep those resources safe, especially in your research. And then what counts as truth, and how do you decide information that you will be used? Especially in my case, I'm getting information from the politicians and practitioners, so maybe they have bias or they didn't telling truth. So how I overcome those issues? I did triangulation, of course. So I support those information with document sources. I check the connection between the statements and also the other sources like reports and also news and other publicly available data. And then about the knowledge production, I think it's hard to answer the reflective questions. Maybe the last one about how do you research? Do your research develop over time? Do you still work on this topic? I would say yes. I'm still working on mega projects. Especially, I'm still looking at the development of high-speed railway, Jakarta-Bandung high-speed railway. And this year, I did collaborate with Pak Delik to continue my PhD study and focusing on the development of land development in the stations of Jakarta-Bandung high-speed railway. Maybe David also have pictures about the differentiation between each stations, and I want to look at the processes of development of each stations and how the local governments can be affected to differentiate the dynamics between each station's development. Yeah, maybe that's it. for me.
Who's more senior?
Which person here?
Beard is longer. I want to, or?
If you want to, go for it.
I mean, actually, it might be better if I do just because I want to bounce off of some things that Tessa said. Can people still hear me online?
Yes.
I'm gonna hope, I'll pray to the God of soon that it's still possible. So actually, let me try and talk about the part about how do you actually create truth, especially if you don't really believe there is such a thing as truth with a capital T. Well, as mentioned up front in my presentation, I'm not an objectivist. I'm also not a relativist. I do believe that truth is socially and relationally created, but that doesn't mean that you can just make up random stuff. In fact, I often think that what I think is true is wrong, right? And so if you start off with those assumptions, you realize, well, you have an opportunity to do good work, but it also means you have a lot of responsibility as a researcher to come up with the closest approximation of what you, in your professional opinion, believe to be the truth, right? So whatever truth I come out with in my PhD thesis is still going to be lowercase t. For sure, people are going to disagree with some of the things I say, right? Or even we might not disagree, but just have slightly different perspectives. Like me and Pak Delek often talk about the politics behind IKN. I don't think I've ever disagreed with him, but we're obviously going to focus on different aspects sometimes, or have different perspectives of the exact same phenomena where his produced truth. And mind you, he published a paper last year on IKN as a mega urbanization project and a political legacy. And that angle is obviously going to be different from what I'm writing about. But as a researcher, I have a job to try and do the best I can to triangulate the findings. So if, for example, 5 people give me slightly different information, but different information, but at least 3 of them say something similar, most likely that's true. Or if it's really completely differing, then I have to keep going. I have to keep asking more people the same questions until I actually can find out, especially if you sometimes don't have documents that support it, or you know there are documents that support what they say, but you don't have access to it. For example, I don't have the master plan for IKN, but I know it exists somewhere out there. People have seen it. And they talk about it looking like this, and I'm like, great, I wish I could see it, but unfortunately I don't have that kind of access, right? So triangulation is extremely important in trying to construct the best approximation of truth that you can. And in terms of practicalities, to add on to what Butes has said, sometimes what it really means is ask good follow-up questions, right? I have sometimes gone back to a point at the end of an interview only to realize that what this person told me as a truth turns out it was just a rumor. They heard from a friend of a friend of a friend that there was some policy discussion at ITB in maybe 2018 or 17 because there was a paper about it. Okay, when did it actually happen? Were you there? Who told you? How do they know? Can you actually, can you give me, is there any evidence? Or can you introduce me to someone who was there, right? And so sometimes, and this makes it really important because, we are fallible as researchers, but so are the people that we're interviewing. So it's very, very important that you don't take information for granted, okay? Always follow up and then do further investigation, either in the interview or separately. I think that was a lot of words about one point, and we had so many questions. I want to go back to then the first question that Chaisha asked. What do we believe is ontologically unique about our case study? So I'm looking at IKN, right? And I mean, that's a bit of it's a trick question, right? Because it's almost as if I then have to pretend that my project is more special than their project, and it's not, okay? But it's actually a really good question because there is definitely something that's different about IKN. And I think fundamentally comes down to the simple but super important fact that IKN as a capital city, not just a new city, but a capital city, is extremely symbolically loaded, right? There is so much symbolic meaning being put into this project because it's supposed to represent the nation, and it is supposed to represent the power of the Indonesian state as it becomes embedded in something physical, in something urban. But it's obviously different from what Suharto used to do or what Sukarno used to do, right? I mean, we've all been to Merdeka Square in Jakarta. That is also the physical embodiment of power in the built space. But e-kind is obviously so different. And I would potentially argue, I'm not actually sure if I agree with myself on this, that e-kind has been construed as a high modernist development project, not a modernist. It's not trying to show Indonesia as a modern post-colonial society. It's trying to create or show or represent Indonesia as a high modernist society that is fully developed and smart and good and livable and green and perfect in all possible ways. Now, as a result of that, the fact that it is so symbolically loaded, I would argue that it's also perhaps more discursively abstract than any other mega urbanization project in Indonesia right now, right? What's the favorite tagline of Gibran and some of the other people in the cabinet? IKN is a new paradigm of development for India. This is meaningless. This is the most meaningless BS label I've ever come across for an infrastructure project, right? And that makes it more challenging to study in IKN. It makes it more sensitive, right? Because it apparently symbolizes everything that's going to be good about Indonesia's future. But it also makes it so much more important to study it and to challenge it and to study up these people coming up with these weird ideas. Okay, I think I'll rest my case there.
All right. Okay, so quite a lot of questions. Let's see what I can get at. I think I'm gonna have slightly different perspectives on research just based on different approaches between Ibu, Tessa, and Anders.
There you
No, just based on kind of what we do, I guess, in terms of methods. In terms of like where to start once you arrive to do field work, for me, it was just spending time in the metropolitan area, riding on motorbikes, getting around, walking around these communities and seeing, obviously with Jackie's help as well, kind of seeing these communities that were impacted by the train, talking to people, and then over time seeing which communities were perhaps more open or friendly to me in terms of where I could build a relationship with and repeatedly go back to over the past 15 months. And then the question of like how to narrow, it's not like a very academic answer, but I'm like a gut feeling type of guy. So it's kind of like, okay, it's time to focus on these particular areas and these topics. And I've heard about this impact from the railway enough in this particular area that I think it's important to go back and talk to people more. And so that's ultimately how there are two villages in my research that are the primary research sites. And that's just because I had the both observational spending time there and seeing it, but also kind of the gut feeling at first of like, these are the two areas that will be the most important for me to spend time in. And then finding informants for me, I do have some of the studying up because I do try to, originally I was going to do a kind of techno-political approach, studying the kind of technical dimensions of the project. So there was some level of trying to understand the planning and policy development and the technical decisions made. And there was still some of that in my project, but a lot of the finding informants is spending time in warungs and local places and introducing myself to people, and a lot of local people will just be interested about me walking around, like what's this guy doing in the village, and then it will lead to a conversation because people are just curious about me. And it oftentimes will end up, we'll talk to them again, and yeah, it's quite nice. In terms of creating truth, I think Anders is spot on about getting us as researchers having a job to get as close to truth as possible. I've had I've been reflecting on this a lot recently and just like asking people about this, their own perspectives. And, you know, I think also depending on your objectives of your project, truth is more or less important to you because it depends on what you are trying to describe. Like for me, a lot of what I'm describing is people's experiences living through these changes. There isn't a particular data or event that I'm particularly trying to have all the data about. It's more the lived experiences and changes for people on a personal level. And in that sense, there isn't like truth, I guess, but then in terms of like, for example, the compensation that a community received for getting relocated, then I'm going to be talking to multiple people to try to understand, okay, what was the compensation that people received? That's a moment where it's like, okay, it's important to get as close as possible to this truth. And then why Bandung? Because I think that's a good question. So originally I was looking at a bunch of projects and the high-speed train seemed like it would be completed, which for me, so this was back in 2020, and for me, I wanted to research a project that would be finished during my project, which for an infrastructure studies approach, it doesn't have to be done. There's plenty of research on abandoned projects, half-finished projects, and looking at the impacts of those. But I wanted to see something in action once it's completed. And so the choice was live in Jakarta or live in Bandung, and I had a professor in Colorado who was like, Bandung is a great place, you should live there. And so then I came to Bandung and then I recruited Anders here, and here we are.
As your coffee buddy, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Cool.
Okay, Mr. Session, do you have any follow-up question or?
I think I'm pretty happy with their response.
We're not gonna have you until you try all different coffee shops, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Very important.
This is our website.
It's hard.
It's so many.
So I think now we have like 15 minutes. 10. So we'll have, let's say, one round QA, like 1 or 3 questions at most. Any of you in here or in the online participants? But while I'm waiting for any response from others, actually, it's gonna be other if we have some comments or question from Pak Wilmar, as he's quite special here because he is actually has been conducted research on both Jakarta, Bandung, and IPA. So I think we have to say something about what they are doing or have done. Okay.
No pressure.
Are you sure? It's gonna be more than 15 minutes. Well, okay, thank you, Pak Dali, for inviting me to give comment. Personally, I like the idea of doing research that cover both sides. You say studying up or studying down. That's why when I did, well, it was not really a research. It was more of like something that came up as I was looking at the development of the idea of the high-speed railway or the IKN that happened a few years ago. And then because trained as a planner, we also always want to see whether what is being discussed as a project, was it really planned or not, right? So that's how I discovered, and then when I wrote the article about the high-speed railway before, this was in 2015. Actually, we never planned the high-speed railway to Bandung, right? The original plan is always to Jakarta, Cirebon, Surabaya, Semarang, Surabaya. So, and then at that time, it was not really, we are not sure because the study was done quite, what do you call it, secretly, or only few people knew about that, including the discussion about the capital. Pak was involved in that meeting in 2018 that Anders mentioned, probably. So it was not open publicly. So it was difficult to really see which perspective that we can tell, right? So how I conducted that is look at what kind of the structure that is there that set the background to the project that happened, and then along the line there are people that get involved. Probably this is the elites, okay, And then they changed, somehow they changed the policy. So what we knew that time, there was a Japanese team conducted a feasibility study. They offer some proposal, and then somehow we didn't like it, and then the Jokowi offered to the Chinese to make another proposal. It was rejected. Even though then we finally accepted the proposal because of that. But then there are people who are involved in that process that it's probably hard to collect information from them. They are not really open. So it is difficult when we are trying to get the real truth. What is the real truth behind the decision? What we can what do you call it? Suspect, yeah. We can only suspect that there's something behind that which we don't know. So actually, in another paper that I wrote about the mega project in the North Jakarta, there was a transition in the way how the private sector. So we were talking about how the private led development influence the making of the policy, and this is also maybe another structure that we don't really take into account in our studies, how influential private sector is in shaping the policy actually. So but yeah, I think my take on what we hear today is like it's good to study the elite, and then also to know what is happening on the ground. But we also need to see the structure and how the player shape the policy that well, now we can see that the project is happening, and then IKN, we are not sure whether we are going to move now. Yeah, like no more August 17 ceremony. It will be hybrid. It's not going to be but high speed is happening. So, and we have to take it that way. But then if we want to learn something from that, then we need to see the process. Well, how it was initially planned, and then how the plan has changed, the policy has changed, regulation changed, everything. So I think this is interesting to see, and something that thanks to all of you to study this, and then maybe something that other countries can learn.
Thank you. I think it's more adding to the discussion, but if any of you want to make any replies.
Well, unless there's questions online.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Otherwise, we can move on to the online questions.
Well, maybe I'll just be super quick. So, I mean, Pat Wilmar takes a more structuralist perspective, which I actually like a lot. I mean, I'm just going about my own research in a particular way out of choice and preference. But one of the challenges, of course, is that, well, first of all, the actors directly involved with these projects, there's no one of them that actually has a full perspective of what's going on, right? And second of all, when we as researchers start to become involved with these people, certainly if we're studying up, right, you actually become a part of the wider assemblage of the policy itself. So, I mean, not that I think my research has or may even have a lot of impact, but I've been involved in so many informal discussions with architects and planners that it's almost inevitable that the outcome of those discussions start to influence some of their own ideas. And at some point I was invited along for a meeting with the Presidential Advisory Group in Jakarta that is doing a review of one aspect of IKN as a policy, right? And my input may or may not end up influencing something somewhere. I mean, I think it's a dialectical process. I have no idea of what it's going to end up looking like. But that makes it even harder when you're within that assemblage to then try and study the overall structures. And I think that's okay, right? I like complexity, and I think that there's nothing wrong with challenging something challenging yourself as a scholar and knowing that you will never come up with, you know, capital T truth. Sorry.
Yeah, I think we can move to the question from. It's from Erwin. Oh, there are two. Oh, no, no. Yeah, from the SAPPK Iron, Pak Erwin, yeah. This our lecturer, I guess, from faculty of Earth Science. Thank you for your presentations. My question is somewhat off topic. Seeing the presentation, it's so interdisciplinary, also so combined with quantitative. Could one of you share your views about the engineering part in this research? Is it the engineering institute? Most of us here still see engineering with ancient perspective. Or I think how this can relate or even unrelated with engineering in your perspective. So that's quite interesting question because talking about infrastructure, traditionally we are talking about technicality in engineering. Then it's quite surprised your presentation is but qualitative. So how can this? I mean that's intriguing. So how do we have a connection with this reality? Yeah, you're the one who's need to responsible because the person who mentioned that
It's on the technical.
infrastructure is qualitative. Wow, that's interesting. You have to explain.
Well, I guess the thing I was gonna add is originally when I planned my project, I really did want to focus quite a bit on the technical dimensions of the project. So engineering decisions, so on, like why were the stations planned the way they were and kind of in the positions that they were, or and this came from a body of literature called Technopolitics, which ultimately looks at how the technical decisions made in infrastructure projects or development projects produce unexpected political effects. And so, for example, there's a book called, forget the title, but it's by the author Andrew Barry, where he looks at a gas pipeline in the state of Georgia. And he looks at how a particular coating on the oil pipeline failed for a particular reason and how a political movement kind of coalesced around this failing of this coating on the oil pipeline. So you can see connections between, for example, the scientists that decided to use a particular coating. Why was it chosen? I think it's kind of common sense that we know that certain politics play a role in quantitative science, even if it is kind of at least advertised as a apolitical approach to things. But ultimately, looking at how, you know, why did people choose to use particular approaches to a problem, and then what are the impacts of those and potentially unexpected impacts of them.
You have one, but clearly he is the one who. Interesting.
Give a similar example from Ikai.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a very silly example, but I think it's hilarious. So you know the central boulevard leading up to the presidential palace? How wide is it? Actually, I'm not even sure because they keep changing it. I think right now it's 80 meters. I have to go and check. Again, nobody knows because it keeps changing. So the width of a road should be the most straightforward, rational, scientific decision. No, it's purely political, and it's not political because, so it was supposed to be, first it was proposed 100 meters, then it was proposed 50 meters. Then they started debating, should it be 60 or 80 meters wide? Where did the 100 meters come from? It was not because the president said, I want it to be 100 meters. It's simply because someone heard the president say something at an event which made them assume that he really liked how wide the avenue in, I think it was St. Petersburg or Moscow was, because 2 tanks can go side by side. So somebody said, well, that means we must have at least the same size. Actually, why don't we make it 100 meters so you can have 3 tanks go side by side? And nobody actually wants that, even the president. Funny anecdote. So even engineering decisions can be politicized.
Okay, I think we before question. Is there any more question? No. All right. Okay. So but actually I have a privilege to ask. Yeah, you still have like 5 minutes. So the thing is, in the past maybe this more practicality in doing research on urban studies related things in Indonesia in the recent years. I think in the past years, there have been quite some bureaucratic changes within the government on how doing research, doing field work. I would see all of you also researching more towards the social and political dimensions. There has been also quite some changes in terms of how the political practices and also social relation in the past few years. So I don't know how this affect your field work. I mean, is there any like bureaucratic, administrative, or even political implication while you are preparing or dealing with the field work? And maybe it's interesting that there's more like foreign researcher experience and local research experience.
I would like to share a bit, even for me as a local alternative Indonesian, it's still difficult for me to dealing with the bureaucratical administrative procedures for doing research. So at the time, I'm still in Sheffield. I'm looking at the rules and all the procedures I should prepare for doing my fieldwork in Indonesia. And yes, I have to like send a request to Minister of Research, like Green and other and it keeps changing surrounding the political regime has also changed. The rules also change. So even for me, it's hard. But eventually, I didn't use any of those letters because I use my personal connection. So yeah, in Indonesia is still quite amusing for me too. Yeah. How about you?
And also, personally, because you have also experience in China and
yeah.
how would you compare and what would be your advice for newcomers in this
Yeah.
range?
I guess for me, it's quite overwhelming at first when you are a foreign researcher trying to understand the landscape of the regulations and bureaucratic steps that you need to take. The interesting, I mean, I don't know if it's changed, but when I was in China in 2019, there was no IRB, so you could just show up and do research, I guess, and that was fine. But here, you have a quite long process of getting an MOU with an institution, getting all these letters from, in my case, like UGM and also ITB too, and in order to get the research permit, and then you come and then you get the KITAS and you get that. But the one thing I was surprised by too was I showed up to a village one day and a village had asked me for a letter from Kasbangpol as well. And so that took me a while to then go to the provincial level, get a letter, Kasbangpol Jawa Barat, then go down to all the way to Soreang in Kabupaten Bandung, like an hour and a half away, get a letter there. And then finally, like 4 months later, finally able to do research. So I think it taught me to be patient. At first, I was perhaps impatient, and now I've kind of learned to take my time. Yeah.
Definition.
Seems like you are more patient than us.
I was less traumatized by David, but maybe that's because I saw a system that was equally bad in India 10 years ago. So I was just like, hello, darkness, my old friend. I feel like bureaucracy, I don't know, it's a thing. And if you put your nose to the grindstone, you'll get through it. I mean, so Indonesia right now for research has switched to what I think is essentially a form of decentralized censorship. BRIN doesn't have the time or interest in checking what we do, so they want ITB and other people to do it for them. But people here at ITB are pretty chill and nice, and I haven't had any problems with that. And in their pros and cons of this model, you can say what you want about it. But in their defense, BRIN replies to my emails within 2 weeks, and that is a lot faster than the IRB at NUS. And now they've switched to an online system, which is dual language even.
Yeah, it's pretty fast.
They
Too.
so not all doom and gloom. You're traumatized though, right?
Still try to know how to be patient.
Takes time.
Yeah.
Take some coffee.
Yeah, and coffee. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, well, we are now arriving into the final part of the seminar. And I will not make any conclusion, I guess, just would like to thank to all of you and the speakers, the dean and also the participants for their active contribution. And I'm going to hand over this to the MC.
Yes, thank you again, all the panelists, Adelis, Bugasa, David, Anils, and Tessia, for giving the other speakers a challenge and for us to reflect upon of what has been presented. And that is the conclusion, concludes our webinar today. Thank you for the participants here and also in the Zoom. Maybe before we end this, can we take a picture together as a documentation? Di sini biasanya sambil
Okay.
berdiri,
Only
and
for
then
us.
all the participants could please take a picture with us and speakers. And afterward, as a bonus for the participants here.
Reach out.
Oh, there's a snack swap and coffee.
You go there.
It's difficult.
Not really, but just need to get used to it.
I'd love to talk to you about your work. Yeah, I'm here until. Yeah. The second. Oh, okay, cool.
Don't good.
Yeah, I grew up in Japan. Most of July, they had to have a Galilean.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, I think. Perfect. I think. Talking to you gonna happen a long time ago.
Around a year, maybe.
Okay, gotcha. But I'm super curious about your work.
I can mention my page. Thesis.
Oh, yeah, if you don't mind, that'd be awesome.
Can you also share?
Yeah, sure.
But somebody
Have you ever-
told me that. Just fun. Yeah, no, it's a.
But.
Photo.
When this was, when we were talking about Palangkaraya, how the boulevard.
Seriously?
I see that. This was it.
Technology, drone, use a drone. This ITB, like. Okay. 1, 2, 3. Good, again, 1, 2, 3. Okay. Gaya bebas.
Freestyle.
Okay, 1, 2, 3. Okay, good, thank you.
Thank you for those.
Fidelity.
We're happy to have you here.
Coming in. Staying to the end.